10,000 years ago, the world changed overnight. Not metaphorically, literally. Ice cores from Greenland tell us that global temperatures rose by 18 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade. Some evidence suggests it happened in just 3 years. Imagine waking up one spring to find winter never returned. For the humans living through this moment, your ancestors, it was both salvation and catastrophe. The younger Dryas, a 1,200-year return to Ice Age conditions, had nearly ended our species. Population bottlenecks in North America show groups dwindling to mere dozens. Food sources vanished. Established hunting grounds turned to tundra. Entire cultures, including the mighty Clovis tradition, simply disappeared from the archaeological record. Then, around 11,600 years ago, the thermostat broke. The mechanism was terrifyingly simple. Massive glacial lakes in North America, swollen with meltwater, suddenly burst their ice dams. The Lake Agassiz flood alone discharged more water than all the world's rivers combined, shutting down ocean currents and triggering climate chaos. But when the system restarted, it overcompensated. Spring came and stayed. For humans huddled in refugia, those isolated pockets where life barely persisted, this warming was miraculous. Plants that hadn't grown for centuries suddenly sprouted. Rivers ran where ice had ruled. Animals began moving, mating, multiplying. The world was suddenly alive again, but it was alien. Your great ancestors, perhaps 500 generations back, stood at the edge of this new world with stone tools and hard-won knowledge of a landscape that no longer existed. The old stories about where to find winter shelter, when the herds would migrate, which plants would fruit, all obsolete. Every survival strategy their parents had taught them was suddenly questionable. In North America, the transformation was especially dramatic. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered Canada like a continental shield, began its death throes. Every summer, Connecticut-sized chunks of ice carved into the Atlantic. The meltwater raised sea levels by 5 feet per century. Coastal camps established by generations of families vanished beneath the waves in a single lifetime. But here's what's remarkable. We adapted. Archaeological sites from this exact period show an explosion of innovation. New tool styles appear suddenly. Trade networks disrupted for centuries reconnect across impossible distances. Art re-emerges. At Monteverde in Chile, at Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, at dozens of sites across the Americas, we see humans not just surviving, but experimenting, creating, pushing boundaries. The morning the Ice Age ended, humanity faced a choice. Cling to the old ways and perish, or reimagine everything. We chose imagination. The same cognitive flexibility that would later give us agriculture, cities, and civilization first gave us the ability to survive a world transformed. 10,000 years ago, your ancestors woke to an impossible spring and decided to live anyway. They were engineers before there were blueprints, chemists before there were formulas, and navigators before there were maps. The Clovis people, America's first widespread culture, didn't just survive the chaos of 10,000 years ago, they thrived in it. Picture this, 13,000 years ago, small bands of humans spread across North America faster than modern populations could with horses. In less than 1,000 years, distinctive Clovis spear points appeared from Alaska to Venezuela. These weren't crude stone chunks. They were technological masterpieces that modern flint knappers struggle to replicate. The signature Clovis point was fluted. A channel ran up both faces, thinning the base for hafting. One mistake during this process destroyed weeks of work. Yet these points were everywhere, standardized like products from a prehistoric factory. This suggests something profound. Clovis people had schools, not buildings, but systems for transmitting complex technical knowledge across generations and geography. By 10,000 years ago, the classic Clovis culture had vanished, but their descendants were revolutionizing American survival. The Folsom people, emerging from Clovis roots, crafted points so delicate they were translucent. At the Lindenmeyer site in Colorado, archaeologists found a Folsom workshop with over 600 tools, including needles, scrapers, and gravers arranged by function. This wasn't just survival, it was specialized industry. But the real innovation was social. Clovis and early Folsom peoples created America's first continental network. Obsidian from Yellowstone appears in Ohio. Jasper from Pennsylvania surfaces in the Carolinas. These weren't accidental trades. Stone from specific quarries was so valued, it traveled over 2,000 miles. Think about that logistics chain. No roads, no wheels, no beasts of burden. Just human determination and a network of relationships spanning a continent. Every piece of exotic stone represents trust, negotiation, and memory. Someone had to remember where the stone came from, who wanted it, and what it was worth. The Jake Bluff site in Oklahoma reveals how these networks functioned. Here, multiple family bands gathered seasonally, leaving behind evidence of communal toolmaking, shared meals, and ritual caches. 20 Clovis caches have been found across America, tools buried for future use or ceremonial purposes. These weren't desperate people scrambling for survival. They were planning, saving, investing in tomorrow. Recent DNA analysis adds another layer. The Anzic Child, a Clovis burial in Montana from 12,600 years ago, shares genetics with indigenous peoples from Alaska to Patagonia. One culture, one people, adapted to environments from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. The diversity of solutions they developed, from desert survival strategies to maritime adaptations, represents humanity at its most ingenious. By 10,000 years ago, post-Clovis Americans weren't just surviving, they were specializing. Eden points in the plains, Dalton points in the southeast, Plano traditions in the Rockies. Each regional variation perfectly adapted to local conditions. The kill site tells a story of desperation and genius. At Murray Springs, Arizona, the bones of 13 mammoths lie where they fell 10,900 years ago. Clovis points still embedded in their ribs. This wasn't a hunt. It was a last stand. Within a generation of this moment, every mammoth in the Americas would be gone. 10,000 years ago, your ancestors lived through the greatest extinction event in human memory. In less than 2,000 years, North America lost 72% of its large mammals. South America lost 83%. Giants that had defined the landscape for millions of years, gone. The question that haunts archaeologists: were we the executioners or fellow victims? The roll call of the vanished reads like mythology. Giant ground sloths standing 20 feet tall, saber-toothed cats with 7-inch fangs, dire wolves, larger and more powerful than any modern predator, glyptodonts, armored tanks the size of Volkswagens. The American lion, 25% larger than its African cousin. All gone by the time your 400th great-grandparents walked the earth. At Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, the evidence is written in layers of earth. Below, mammoth bones with Clovis points. Above, empty sediment, then bison bones with Folsom points. The transition is sharp as a blade. One world ended, another began, and humans were there for both. But here's what the bones don't show: the psychological trauma of watching your world disappear. Imagine being a child 10,000 years ago. Your grandfather tells stories of mammoth hunts, demonstrates calls that bring the giants close, but you'll never see one. The skills passed down for 1,000 generations, reading mammoth behavior, knowing their migration routes, understanding their weak points, all suddenly useless. The Younger Dryas climate catastrophe created a perfect storm. Rapid warming destroyed the Mammoth Steppe, that vast grassland that once stretched from Spain to Canada. Plants the megafauna depended on vanished. Birth rates plummeted, populations fragmented. Then humans arrived with new weapons, new strategies, and desperate hunger. But we didn't just hunt them. We learned from their disappearance. At Kimswick in Missouri, mastodon bones from 10,000 years ago show something remarkable. Selective hunting. Humans were taking mostly males, mostly adults, trying to preserve breeding populations. We understood sustainability, but understanding came too late. The extinction forced innovation. Folsom hunters developed techniques for taking bison that would define plains culture for 10,000 years. They learned to build corrals, coordinate drives, predict stampede physics. At the Jones Miller site in Colorado, 300 bison were killed in a single event 10,000 years ago. This wasn't luck. It was engineering, planning, and communal execution requiring dozens of coordinated hunters. The tools evolved too. Post-extinction points became smaller, more numerous, designed for medium game that required different strategies. Hunters who once needed one perfect shot at a mammoth now needed dozens of arrows for deer, elk, and smaller prey. We adapted because we had to. The giants were gone, but their ghosts shaped everything that came after. The old woman remembered when you could walk to the island. Now, 10 winters later, it was a day's paddle away. The water that had crept up the beach slowly at first was now hungry, taking 100 steps of shore each spring. This was the reality for countless coastal peoples 10,000 years ago. The ocean was coming, and it would not stop. Between 11,000 and 8,000 years ago, global sea levels rose 195 feet, not gradually, in pulses. Meltwater, Pulse 1b, around 9,500 years ago, raised oceans by 92 feet in just 500 years. That's 2 inches every year, fast enough that a child could watch their birthplace disappear beneath the waves before reaching adulthood. For Americans living along the coast 10,000 years ago, this wasn't abstract climate change, it was daily crisis. The Atlantic shelf, once dry land extending 100 miles from the current coast, vanished. Whole cultures, their camps, their burial grounds, their sacred sites, all drowned. We know they existed only from stone tools dredged up by fishing boats and the occasional underwater archaeological survey. At Port Joli in Nova Scotia, submerged forests tell the story. Stumps of 10,000-year-old trees stand in formation beneath the harbor, their roots still gripping paleosols, ancient soils that once supported human camps. Archaeologists diving these sites find hearths, post holes, and stone tools in situ, frozen in the moment the water arrived. But the real drama was human. Imagine the conferences held around fires, elders arguing whether to move inland or adapt to the new shoreline. Some groups chose elevation, establishing camps on hills that seemed impossibly far from water. Others developed new technologies, boats, fishing gear, seasonal mobility patterns that followed the changing coast. The Dalton people of the southeast faced a particular challenge. Their territory included vast river valleys that became estuaries, then bays, then open ocean. At Sloan in Arkansas, a cemetery from this period shows something remarkable. Grave goods include marine shells from the Gulf Coast, 500 miles away. Even as the ocean destroyed their lands, they were trading with it, adapting to it, making it part of their identity. The Pacific coast adapted differently. California's Channel Islands, once connected or nearly connected to the mainland, became isolated. The peoples living there faced a choice: evacuate or evolve. They chose evolution. By 10,000 years ago, Channel Islanders had developed sophisticated boats, plank canoes capable of open ocean voyages. They didn't just survive isolation, they mastered it. The psychological impact was generational. Stories from indigenous peoples worldwide describe great floods, lost lands, drowned ancestors. These aren't myths, they're memories, transmitted across 400 generations with stunning accuracy. Aboriginal Australians can still point to specific underwater features their ancestors walked on 10,000 years ago. For the Americans of 10,000 BCE, the rising seas weren't just an environmental challenge, they were a cognitive one. How do you plan for the future when the ground beneath you isn't permanent? How do you bury your dead when their graves will be underwater? How do you teach your children about a world that no longer exists? They answered with flexibility, innovation, and memory. They became the first climate refugees and the first climate adapters. The spear point was perfect. 4 inches of translucent stone, fluted on both faces, sharp enough to shave with. The young hunter had spent 3 weeks crafting it, learning from his grandfather who learned from his grandfather. It was a mammoth point made for one purpose. There was just one problem. Nobody had seen a mammoth in 2 summers. This was the reality for humans across North America 10,000 years ago. They were the last generation to carry Ice Age knowledge, and the first to discover it was obsolete. At the Colby site in Wyoming, we find one of the last mammoth kills in North America, dated to 10,800 years ago. 7 mammoths stacked in 2 piles, cached for winter consumption. The hunters who made this kill couldn't have known they were conducting one of humanity's final mammoth hunts. They preserved the meat according to traditions stretching back millennia, planning to return when the snow made transport easier. But something went wrong. The cache was never retrieved. Environmental DNA from Alaska's North Slope now tells us mammoths survived there until at least 10,500 years ago. Maybe later. Small populations, isolated, inbred, making their last stand in patches of suitable habitat. For the humans living alongside them, each sighting must have carried weight. Mythological, practical, and deeply emotional. Consider the knowledge that died with the mammoths. Humans had been hunting them for 30,000 years. We knew their seasonal movements, their feeding patterns, their social structures. We could predict where pregnant females would shelter, when bulls would fight, how herds would react to fire or sound. This wasn't just data, it was culture, identity, survival strategy refined over 1,000 generations. The transition appears in the archaeological record like a scar. Below, large, elaborate Clovis points designed for megafauna. Above, smaller, more numerous points for smaller game. Toolkits expand to include more scrapers, more processing implements, more variety. The specialization of mammoth hunting gave way to generalization. At the Lamb Springs site in Colorado, dated to exactly 10,000 years ago, we see this transition frozen in time. Mammoth bones bearing cut marks lie beside the bones of bison, deer, and smaller game. The tool assemblage includes both old-style mammoth processing tools and newer, smaller implements. This was a culture in transition, carrying 2 worlds worth of knowledge. But they adapted with stunning speed. The Folsom culture, emerging right at 10,000 years ago, developed bison hunting strategies that would define plains life for millennia. They invented the buffalo jump, the coordinated drive, the seasonal round that followed herds across thousands of miles. They transformed from mammoth specialists to bison specialists in perhaps 3 generations. The stories, though, the stories lasted longer. Every Native American culture has tales of giants, of monsters, of creatures that once walked the earth but do so no longer. These aren't fantasies, they're memories, preserved in oral tradition with remarkable accuracy. The Crow speak of the big elk that was hairless, with a nose like a snake. The Penobscot describe creatures with teeth like stakes. These are mammoth memories, encoded in myth, surviving 10,000 years after the last one fell. Dawn comes without an alarm at 5:47 a.m., painted orange across the Nebraska plains. You wake not because you must, but because your body knows. The fire needs feeding before the cold seeps into young bones. Your name has been lost to time, but you were real. A woman, perhaps 30 winters old, ancient by some measures, vital by others. Your muscles tell the story of your life. Dense attachments at the shoulder from throwing, scarred hands from flint napping, strong legs from walking 12 miles yesterday, and 12 more today. You wake beside your daughter, her breath visible in the spring chill, your son curled against your sister, 9 souls sharing warmth in a shelter of bent willow and bison hide. The day begins with water, always water. The stream runs 50 steps from camp, close enough for convenience, far enough that animals won't surprise you at night. You've camped here before, 3 springs ago. The fire pit you dug then still marks the ground. This is not random wandering, it's a choreographed dance with the land you've perfected over generations. Your husband left before first light with your brother, tracking deer spotted yesterday evening. Success isn't guaranteed. It rarely is. But the spring roots are emerging, and you know exactly where. Your grandmother showed you, as her grandmother showed her, the secret spots where prairie turnips grow fat and numerous. Your fingers read the soil like text, knowing by touch which roots are ready, which need another moon. By mid-morning, you've walked 2 miles, filled 3 baskets. Your daughter shadows you, learning through mimicry. She's 8 winters, old enough to distinguish 40 different plants, young enough to complain about the weight of her gathering bag. You teach her the same songs your mother taught you, mnemonics disguised as melodies that encode which plants heal, which harm, which fill hungry bellies. The technology you carry would astound modern minimalists. A knife hafted with sinew, sharp enough for surgery, a digging stick, fire-hardened and polished from use, leather pouches containing dried meat, seeds, medicinal herbs, a bone needle, cordage made from nettle fibers. Each item represents hundreds of hours of accumulated knowledge, thousands of years of refinement. Noon brings unexpected fortune. Your son finds a fresh elk carcass, killed by wolves but barely touched. The pack fled at human scent. This is 3 days of protein if you work fast. Everyone drops everything. You butcher with precision learned from childhood, wasting nothing. Organs eaten raw for their vitamins, meat cut in strips for drying, bones cracked for marrow, hide scraped for processing later. By evening, the hunters return empty-handed, but not disappointed. The elk was providence. Around the fire, your husband reshapes a broken point while you repair a basket. Your mother tells the children about coyote stealing fire, the same story she heard 70 winters ago. Your son practices with his new atlatl, throwing at a target of twisted grass. This is your office, your home, your entire world condensed to a fire circle. Tomorrow, you'll walk toward the river, following the green up of spring. You sleep knowing every star by name. History books call them gatherers, as if they merely picked up what nature dropped. The truth would humble modern botanists. The women of 10,000 years ago were living libraries, carrying encyclopedic knowledge that meant the difference between feast and famine, healing and death. At White Dog Cave in Arizona, a woman was buried 10,000 years ago with a toolkit that tells her story. Specialized grinding stones worn smooth from decades of use, a hafted knife with plant residue still visible, baskets waterproofed with pine pitch, and seeds. Dozens of varieties cached for planting or eating. She wasn't just gathering, she was managing entire ecosystems. New research from dental calculus hardened plaque on ancient teeth has revolutionized our understanding. Women's teeth from this period contain microfossils of over 140 different plant species. Men's teeth average 60. This isn't just about diet, it's about specialization. Women were the botanical experts, the seed savers, the living agricultural encyclopedias before agriculture existed. Consider what this knowledge meant. In Nebraska, 10,000 years ago, a woman could identify prairie turnips by their leaves from 50 yards away, knowing that roots harvested after the third moon of summer would be bitter. She knew that lamb's quarter seeds, when ground and mixed with rendered fat, would keep through winter. She understood that willow bark eased pain, that echinacea fought infection, that cattail roots could be processed into flour. But here's what anthropology missed for a century. These women weren't just collecting, they were cultivating. At the Costa site in Illinois, dating to 10,000 years ago, archaeologists found evidence of deliberate plant management. Certain useful species appear in concentrations impossible without human intervention. Women were selecting, protecting, and encouraging beneficial plants thousands of years before formal agriculture. The processing technology alone was astounding. At Dust Cave in Alabama, grinding stones from 10,500 years ago show where patterns indicating specific motions for specific seeds. Different stones for different plants, each with its own technique. These weren't crude tools. They were specialized implements requiring years to perfect. One study found it takes 300 hours of use to develop the kind of wear patterns seen on these stones. Women also controlled fire ecology. At dozens of sites across North America, charcoal layers from 10,000 years ago show deliberate burning patterns. Not wildfires, controlled burns. Women knew that burning prairie in early spring promoted tender shoots that attracted game. They understood that fire cycles determined which plants would dominate, which would fruit, which would provide medicine. The social power this knowledge carried was immense. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers show that women's gathering provides 60 to 80% of calories. The stereotype of man the hunter feeding the tribe is mythology. Women fed the world, and their knowledge was survival itself. At the Windover site in Florida, preserved brain tissue from 10,000 years ago has yielded intact DNA. Half the bodies are women, buried with the same grave goods as men. Points, tools, ornaments, no gender hierarchy in death, suggesting none in life. These women weren't subordinate. They were essential, powerful, and recognized as such. Their legacy? Every food crop you eat descended from plants these women identified, selected, and protected. The footprints are heartbreaking and hilarious. Preserved in mud at the White Sands site in New Mexico, they show a toddler, maybe 2 years old, following an adult for over a mile, occasionally carried, occasionally wandering off to investigate something interesting, then hurrying back. These 10,000-year-old tracks capture universal childhood, curiosity, distraction, and the patient adult who kept them alive. Childhood 10,000 years ago wasn't innocent, but it wasn't brutal either. At the Upward Sun River site in Alaska, 2 infants were buried 11,500 years ago with elaborate grave goods, ochre-covered bones, decorated antler rods, and perfectly crafted stone points. Someone loved these children enough to include tools they'd never use for a journey they'd never complete. The same site yielded a 3-year-old cremation, the oldest in North America, suggesting complex beliefs about childhood, death, and afterlife. But for those who survived infancy, and only half did, life was an intensive apprenticeship. By age 4, archaeological evidence shows children were making their own tools, not well, but persistently. At the Thunderbird site in Virginia, clusters of amateur flint-knapping debris sit beside expert work, small clumsy flakes with step fractures and hinge terminations. every mistake a modern napper makes while learning. These practice areas were tolerantly maintained beside adult workshops. By age 7, ethnographic parallels suggest children knew dozens of plants, could track common animals, and contributed meaningfully to group survival. Coprolites, fossilized feces from children, show diverse diets including seeds, nuts, and plant materials that required processing knowledge. They weren't fed, they participated in feeding themselves. The toys tell us about training. A dollhouse cave in Utah, miniature atlatls and tiny points date to 10,000 years ago. Perfect replicas at 1/3 scale, too small for hunting, but ideal for developing muscle memory. Children played at being adults, but play was preparation. Every game taught survival. Skeletal analysis reveals their physical reality. Growth patterns show seasonal stress, hunger winters, abundant summers. But bone density exceeds modern children's by 20%. These kids climbed, ran, carried, and worked from the moment they could walk. Harris lines, growth interruptions visible in bones, appear during weaning around age 3, showing the stress of transitioning from breast milk to adult food. But there was tenderness too. At the Anzac site in Montana, a 2-year-old boy was buried with 125 stone tools and 15,000 shell beads. The craftsmanship represents thousands of hours of labor. This wasn't just a child, this was a beloved child, mourned by an entire community. Learning happened through immersion. No classrooms, no age segregation. A 6-year-old might help a grandmother make baskets while listening to uncles plan tomorrow's hunt. Knowledge wasn't compartmentalized. It was absorbed through proximity. Songs encoded plant knowledge. Stories taught geography. Myths explained dangers. The transition to adulthood came early. Toothwear patterns suggest dietary changes around age 12 to 14, when children began eating tougher, less processed foods. The diet of adults. Isotope analysis of bones shows mobility patterns changing at the same age, suggesting participation in longer hunting or gathering expeditions. By 15, you were fully adult. By 30, you were an elder. By 40, if you lived that long, you were the library, the teacher, the keeper of memories. Children of 10,000 years ago didn't have childhoods as we understand them. They had apprenticeships in being human. The skull tells a story of impossible survival. Found at Shanidar Cave, it belonged to a man who lived 10,000 years ago with a withered arm, a crushed eye socket, and a traumatic brain injury that should have killed him. Yet he lived for years after these injuries, someone feeding him, cleaning him, keeping him alive. This wasn't medicine as we know it. It was something more profound, community care that refused to abandon the wounded. 10,000 years ago, your ancestors practiced medicine that would seem alien and familiar simultaneously. At Riparo Fredian in Italy, a severely decayed tooth was filled with bitumen, natural tar, mixed with plant fibers and hair, 13,000 years ago. This wasn't random packing. It was designed dentistry, understanding that sealing infection prevented spread. The pharmacology was sophisticated. At El Cedron in Spain, Neanderthal dental calculus from 49,000 years ago revealed yarrow and chamomile, neither nutritious, both medicinal. By 10,000 years ago, humans had expanded this pharmacy exponentially. Willow bark for pain, containing aspirin's precursor, echinacea for infection, foxglove for heart problems, all appear in archaeological contexts suggesting deliberate use. But here's what's remarkable. Dosing. At Shanidar, pollen analysis shows medicinal plants in specific proportions, not random gathering, measured administration. Someone understood that too much foxglove stopped hearts instead of regulating them. This knowledge, transmitted without writing, required extraordinary precision in teaching and learning. Surgical evidence astounds modern doctors. At Buran-Kaya in Crimea, a skull from 10,000 years ago shows successful trepanation, surgical opening of the skull. The bone regrowth proves the patient survived months, maybe years. Someone cut through skull without killing the patient, without causing massive infection, using stone tools. The precision required suggests this wasn't the first attempt. Broken bones tell stories of treatment. At Indian Knoll in Kentucky, numerous healed fractures from 10,000 years ago show evidence of setting and splinting. Not perfect, some healed crooked, but functional. People with broken legs walked again. Shattered arms regained partial use. Someone knew how to align bones, immobilize them, and manage recovery. The psychological component was integral. At Dolny Viestonice, a woman with congenital deformities was buried with elaborate care 26,000 years ago, but similar treatment continued through 10,000 years ago. Physical difference didn't mean abandonment. The community adapted, accommodated, included. Childbirth management appears in burial positions. Women who died in childbirth were buried differently, often with specific stones or tools suggesting midwifery knowledge. Infant mortality was high, 50% before age 5, but not from ignorance. Coprolites show medicinal plants given to children, targeted treatments for parasites and infections. Pain management went beyond herbs. At multiple sites, evidence suggests acupuncture-like practices, small, deliberate punctures in specific patterns. Endorphin release through controlled pain, possibly combined with ritual and plant medicines. The holistic approach, treating mind, body, and spirit simultaneously, predates written medicine by millennia. Disease-shaped culture. Tuberculosis appears in American skeletons from 10,000 years ago, probably jumping from bison to humans. Communities developed quarantine practices. Separate shelters for the sick appear archaeologically. They couldn't see bacteria, but they understood contagion through observation. The real revolution was compassion institutionalized. The breakthrough happened in someone's hands 10,500 years ago, probably by accident. A napper working on a spear point pushed instead of struck, and a flake came off with unprecedented control. Within 500 years, pressure flaking had revolutionized toolmaking across the Americas. By 10,000 years ago, fulsome points were so thin they were translucent, engineering marvels that modern replicators achieve only with decades of practice. But the real innovation wasn't the technique, it was the mindset. Humans 10,000 years ago approached toolmaking like we approach software development, constant iteration, platform standardization, and modular design. Take the microblade revolution. At Swan Point in Alaska, archaeologists found cores the size of bullets that produced dozens of identical blades, each no bigger than a fingernail. These weren't tools, they were components. Inserted into bone or wood handles, they created saws, knives, projectiles. The same blade serving different functions depending on its housing. This is systems thinking, 12,000 years before systems theory. The toolkit of 10,000 years ago would fill a modern hardware store. At Dust Cave in Alabama, one family's equipment included hafted knives with replaceable blades, compound adhesives mixing pine pitch with ochre and charcoal, needles so fine they could work sinew through hide without tearing, specialized scrapers for different materials, one for fresh hide, another for dry, grinding stones calibrated for specific seeds, and cordage ranging from fishing line to load-bearing rope. Each tool represented accumulated genius. A simple hide scraper encoded knowledge about angle of attack, pressure distribution, and edge maintenance. The hafting, attaching stone to wood, required understanding of thermal expansion, adhesive chemistry, and mechanical stress. Pine pitch alone wasn't strong enough, it needed tempering with charcoal. Too much made it brittle, too little left it soft. This wasn't trial and error, this was material science. The atlatl revolutionized hunting. This spear thrower multiplied human arm strength, launching darts at 100 miles per hour. But the physics were complex. Weight distribution, flex patterns, release timing, all had to synchronize. At Indian Creek in Montana, 10,000-year-old atlatl weights show experimentation with mass distribution, fine-tuning for different prey and distances. Specialized tools emerged for processing plants. At Bonneville Estates in Nevada, groundstone implements from 10,000 years ago show wear patterns indicating specific grinding motions for different seeds. The angle of wear, the polish patterns, even microscopic plant residues reveal purpose-built tools for individual species. This wasn't one mortar and pestle. This was an entire processing suite. But perhaps the most revolutionary tool was invisible: standardization. Clovis points from Alaska match those from Mexico in proportion and production sequence. This required shared mental templates, agreed upon standards, and teaching methods that preserve precision across thousands of miles without writing. It's the prehistoric equivalent of maintaining ISO standards without documentation. The tool that changed everything wasn't stone, bone, or wood. It was the idea that tools themselves could evolve, that technology could improve, that each generation could build on the last. By 10,000 years ago, humans had invented not just tools, but the concept of technology itself. The Clovis Empire never existed, but their kingdom stretched from sea to shining sea. By 10,000 years ago, their descendants had shattered into a dozen regional cultures, each one a unique answer to the question, how do we survive when the world we mastered no longer exists? At Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, the archaeological layers read like a book. Bottom layer, Clovis points among mammoth bones. Middle, a sterile gap, an absence, a pause while the world reorganized. Top, Folsom points among bison bones, then Plano, then archaic. Each transition marks not just new tools, but new minds, new solutions to an America that kept changing. The Folsom Revolution began around 10,900 years ago. But by 10,000 BCE, it had matured into something extraordinary. Their signature points were engineering poetry, so thin that light passed through them, so precisely flaked that modern knappers consider them the pinnacle of stone tool technology. But Folsom was more than pretty points. It was a complete reimagining of human survival in post-mammoth America. At the Agate Basin site in Wyoming, we see this transformation frozen in time. Folsom hunters didn't just kill bison, they orchestrated their destruction. Drive lanes built from stones and brush funneled herds toward cliffs or into box canyons. The kill sites show selective harvesting, mostly females and yearlings, preserving breeding bulls. This wasn't desperation, it was management. Meanwhile, in the eastern woodlands, former Clovis peoples developed into what archaeologists call Dalton culture. Their points were Swiss Army knives, serving as spears, knives, and drills through clever resharpening. At the Sloan site in Arkansas, a Dalton cemetery from 10,500 years ago contained 439 stone tools buried with 30 people. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. But more remarkable was the variation. Each region, each family group perhaps, had developed its own style. Standardization was fragmenting into innovation. The West Coast tells another story entirely. At Daisy Cave on San Miguel Island, people were harvesting shellfish, fishing deep waters, and hunting sea mammals by 11,500 years ago. By 10,000 years ago, they had developed specialized tools for each marine resource, toggling harpoons for seals, composite fish hooks for rockfish, specialized prying tools for shellfish. They weren't land people who occasionally visited the ocean. They were maritime specialists. In the Great Basin, The Western stemmed tradition emerged alongside and possibly before Clovis. By 10,000 years ago, these people had developed a completely different technological approach. Their points were stemmed rather than fluted. Their economy focused on plants and small game rather than megafauna. At Bonneville Estate's rock shelter, processing tools outnumber hunting tools 3 to 1. Each culture was asking the same questions but finding different answers. How do you hunt without mammoths? How do you travel without following huge herds? How do you teach children skills for animals that no longer exist? The diversity of solutions represents human creativity at its finest. Social networks became crucial. Obsidian from specific sources appears hundreds of miles away, but the distribution patterns changed. Instead of the continental network of Clovis times, regional exchange systems emerged. By 10,000 years ago, there was no longer one America. There were dozens, each adapted to its own corner of a transformed continent. The cliff was perfect, a 30-foot drop hidden by a gentle slope on the approach. The wind blew from the east, masking human scent. Below, rocks waited to break legs and ribs. This wasn't a natural feature, it was a weapon, refined over generations. And 10,000 years ago, at the bonfire shelter in Texas, it claimed 120 bison in a single orchestrated moment of chaos and calculation. The Buffalo Jump was aerospace engineering built from stone and flesh. Every variable had to align: wind direction, herd position, escape route psychology, runner speed, and timing. One mistake, and months of preparation vanished in a thunder of hooves headed the wrong direction. Planning began seasons in advance. At Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump in Alberta, used continuously for 6,000 years but with techniques developed by 10,000 years ago, archaeologists found drive lanes extending over a mile. These weren't random rock piles. They were carefully placed cairns, each one positioned to funnel animals toward doom while appearing natural. Building them required understanding bison vision, herd dynamics, and panic psychology. The runners were specialists, young men and women trained from childhood to sprint for miles, to mimic wounded bison, to know exactly when to reveal themselves and trigger the stampede. Too early and the herd scattered, too late and they were trampled. Ethnographic accounts from historic plains peoples describe runners who could maintain position alongside stampeding bison for miles, gradually turning the herd through body position alone. But the genius was psychological. Bison are suspicious, but not stupid. The successful jump required weeks of conditioning, hunters gradually habituating the herd to human presence at increasing proximities. Like boiling frogs, the bison never noticed the trap tightening until the final morning when suddenly humans appeared everywhere, whooping, waving blankets, and the only escape route led to air. The Jones-Miller site in Colorado, dated to 10,000 years ago, reveals the sophistication. This wasn't cliff-based, but used a manufactured trap, a corral strong enough to hold panicked bison. Postmolds show a structure requiring 200 trees, each one dragged miles from river valleys. The engineering required: calculating force loads of charging bison, understanding breakage points, designing gates that could close against tons of pressure, rivals modern construction. The killing efficiency was stunning, but the processing more so. At Bonfire Shelter, 120 bison represented 80,000 pounds of meat. Without refrigeration, this required immediate action. Every member of multiple bands, perhaps 200 people, worked simultaneously. Ethnographic parallels suggest strict protocols. Specific families got specific cuts. Pregnant women received livers for iron. Elders got tender tongues. Children helped with hide preparation. The waste was minimal. Meat cut in strips for drying. Bones cracked for marrow, then boiled for grease. Hides scraped for clothing and shelter. sinew extracted for thread, horns shaped into tools, hooves boiled for glue. Even the partially digested grass in stomachs was eaten as a vitamin-rich supplement. The social coordination required was extraordinary. No chiefs, no formal hierarchy, yet hundreds of people working with choreographed precision. The jump wasn't just a hunting technique, it was a social technology, creating community through shared labor and shared feast. By 10,000 years ago, the buffalo jump had evolved from desperate experiment to refined science. The nugget was the size of a fist, gleaming red-orange in the Michigan sun. The young woman who found it 10,000 years ago knew exactly what she'd discovered. Her grandmother had shown her worked copper, passed down through generations. But this, pure native copper, weathered from bedrock, this was wealth beyond imagination. Not because it was rare, but because it could become anything. The old copper culture of the Great Lakes represents one of archaeology's most stunning revelations. Americans were working metal thousands of years before anyone else on Earth developed metallurgy. While the rest of humanity was still in the Stone Age, indigenous peoples around Lake Superior were crafting sophisticated copper tools through techniques that wouldn't appear elsewhere for millennia. The copper wasn't smelted, it didn't need to be. Glaciers had done the work, shearing away pure copper from volcanic deposits and scattering nuggets across the landscape. Some weighed tons, but transforming raw copper into tools required innovation that modern metallurgists find impressive. At the Oconto site in Wisconsin, copper artifacts dating to 8,500 years ago show evidence of annealing, heating metal to specific temperatures to alter its crystalline structure, making it workable without becoming brittle. This wasn't random heating. Too hot and the copper cracked. Too cool and it remained rigid. The precise temperature control required, using only wood fires and careful observation, represents material science at its most intuitive. By 10,000 years ago, the techniques were already emerging. Cold hammering, the repeated percussion that slowly shapes copper, appears at sites across the western Great Lakes. But cold hammering alone creates metal fatigue, causing fractures. These early metalworkers discovered that alternating cold work with controlled heating eliminated brittleness. They invented work hardening and tempering 5,000 years before Bronze Age smiths. The tools they produced weren't primitive, socketed spear points with rat-tail tangs for hafting, awls so fine they could pierce the thinnest hide, fish hooks with barbs and line attachments, crescent-shaped knives that modern users describe as perfectly balanced, decorative beads requiring techniques like hollow drilling that wouldn't be reinvented for millennia. But here's the mystery. They had this technology and barely used it. Copper tools appear alongside stone tools, never replacing them. The metal was traded across thousands of miles. Great Lakes copper appears in Florida, Alberta, and the Atlantic coast, but it remains supplemental, special, perhaps sacred. The cultural implications are profound. Copper working required specialized knowledge, suggesting the emergence of craft specialists. The wide distribution implies sophisticated trade networks. The limited use suggests value beyond utility, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps spiritual, certainly social. At the Osceola site in Wisconsin, a child was buried with copper bracelets 9,500 years ago. The metal was worked thin, decorated with geometric patterns, and showed wear from use. This wasn't just ornamentation, it was identity, status, memory made tangible. The child's burial with such wealth suggests inherited position or profound grief, or both. The real revolution wasn't metallurgical, it was cognitive. These people looked at raw metal and saw potential. They developed processing techniques through experimentation. They created trade networks to distribute knowledge and materials. They invented an entirely new category of human creation. Then, mysteriously, around 3,000 years ago, the old copper culture largely abandoned metalworking. Climate change, population shifts, cultural evolution. We don't know why. The woman stood knee-deep in the Pacific, feeling with her toes for the telltale hardness of abalone. The Channel Islands rose from morning fog 20 miles offshore, a journey she'd made dozens of times in plank canoes sealed with tar from beach seeps. This was Santa Barbara 10,000 years ago, and life was abundant beyond modern imagination. California's first peoples lived in Earth's greatest natural supermarket. The archaeological record from 10,000 years ago reveals not struggle, but choice. So many food sources that selection became cultural rather than survival-based. At Daisy Cave on San Miguel Island, remains from 11,500 years ago show people were eating 18 species of shellfish, 19 types of fish, and sea mammals from dolphins to elephant seals. The technology was specialized and sophisticated. By 10,000 years ago, Channel Islanders had developed the tomol, plank canoes capable of carrying 4,000 pounds across rough seas. These weren't dugouts but engineered vessels. Redwood planks sealed with yop, a mixture of pine pitch and asphaltum, drilled and sewn with milkweed cordage, capable of speeds over 8 knots. Building one required coordinated labor from specialist teams and materials gathered across hundreds of miles. On the mainland, the Millingstone Horizon culture was revolutionizing plant processing. At the Cross Creek site, grinding stones from 10,000 years ago show where patterns from processing acorns, a challenging food that requires leaching toxic tannins. The process was complex: shelling, grinding to flour, repeated hot water washing, then cooking. One mistake and the meal was inedible, yet acorns became a staple, providing more calories per hour of labor than farming. The diversity was staggering. Coastal groups harvested seaweed for salt. Desert peoples processed agave hearts in stone-lined pits. Mountain communities drove deer into brush barriers. Valley inhabitants managed controlled burns to encourage seed-producing plants. Each ecosystem had its specialists, and they traded constantly. At Tulare Lake, once California's largest freshwater body, now drained for agriculture, people 10,000 years ago lived year-round on fish, waterfowl, and tule elk. The lake was so productive that sedentism emerged without agriculture. Villages of tule reed houses sheltered hundreds. Social stratification appeared. Hereditary chiefs, craft specialists, extensive trade networks. The tar seeps of Southern California provided another unique resource. Natural asphaltum bubbled from the ground, used for waterproofing, adhesive, and decoration. At Carpinteria, production sites from 10,000 years ago show industrial-scale processing, heating pits to purify tar, molds for forming cakes, and distribution networks reaching Nevada. But the real revolution was management. These weren't passive gatherers, but ecosystem engineers. They pruned trees to increase nut production, broadcast seeds of useful plants, diverted streams to create wetlands, and burned grasslands to attract game. Archaeological evidence shows certain plant species appearing in concentrations impossible without human intervention. Population density exceeded anywhere else in prehistoric North America. By 10,000 years ago, California supported perhaps 300,000 people, 1/3 of the continent's population on 1% of its land. They achieved this without farming, without cities, without the supposed necessities of civilization. Social complexity emerged from abundance. The windmiller culture, emerging around 10,000 years ago, shows elaborate burials with differential wealth, specialized toolkits suggesting occupational differentiation, and exotic materials indicating 1,000-mile trade relationships. California dreaming wasn't fantasy. It was the reality of perfect adaptation to Earth's most generous landscape. The trail of shrines stretched 40 miles across the Sonoran Desert, each one a pile of stones where travelers left offerings, shell beads, carved sticks, prayers for water. This was the Camino del Diablo, the Devil's Highway, and 10,000 years ago it was already ancient, worn deep by countless journeys between water sources that might be 3 days apart. Desert survival wasn't about conquering the landscape but reading it like scripture. Every shadow had meaning, every bird flight indicated water, every cloud promised or lied about rain. The peoples of the American Southwest 10,000 years ago had decoded this language through millennia of observation, creating a blueprint for thriving where others saw only death. At Ventana Cave in Arizona, occupation layers span from 11,000 years ago to historic times, continuous habitation in one of Earth's harshest environments. The secret wasn't the cave, but the knowledge. 47 water sources within a day's walk, each with its own seasonal reliability. Some were rivers, some springs, some tinajas, natural rock basins that held rainwater for months. Knowing their locations, their capacity, their quality meant life. The toolkit was specialized for scarcity, portable water containers made from gourds and lined with pine pitch, carrying nets that distributed weight across shoulders for long-distance transport, specialized digging sticks for accessing roots that stored moisture, grinding stones cached at processing sites to avoid carrying weight. Every tool served multiple purposes, nothing was redundant. But the genius was timing. Desert peoples 10,000 years ago had developed a complex seasonal round that followed resources as they peaked. Saguaro fruit in June, mesquite pods in July, agave hearts in winter, spring herbs after rain. They moved not randomly, but precisely, arriving at each location within days of optimal harvest. This required intergenerational knowledge, encoded in stories and songs that served as maps and calendars simultaneously. At Guilanaquit's cave in Mexico, coprolites from 10,000 years ago reveal the diversity of desert diet. 89 plant species identified from a single season's deposits. Agave, prickly pear, mesquite, piñon nuts, grass seeds, even grasshoppers and lizards. The nutritional analysis shows better vitamin and mineral profiles than agricultural diets. Desert peoples weren't surviving, they were thriving. Water management went beyond finding, it involved creating. At multiple sites across the Southwest, rock dams from 10,000 years ago channeled runoff into natural basins. These weren't random rock piles, but engineered structures understanding flow rates, sediment deposition, and evaporation. Some created microenvironments where useful plants thrived, turning barren washes into linear gardens. The social adaptations were crucial. Desert bands were smaller than elsewhere, 15 to 25 people typically, to avoid overtaxing water sources. But they maintained extensive networks, gathering annually at reliable water for trade, marriages, and information exchange. Bad year in the Chihuahuan Desert. Move west to relatives in the Sonoran. Drought everywhere. Stories told where ancestors found water in similar times. Heat management was sophisticated. Travel at night, rest in shade, minimal clothing but maximum coverage. Shelters designed for ventilation, not insulation. Metabolic adaptation too. Desert peoples consumed less water than newcomers while maintaining hydration, a physiological adjustment taking generations to develop. The archaeological signature is subtle. Desert peoples left little because they carried little. But what remains speaks to ingenious adaptation. The hill whispered. That's what the shepherds said for generations. Strange sounds from within the earth, especially at sunset. They called it Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, and avoided it after dark. When archaeologists finally listened to those whispers in 1994, they found something that shouldn't exist. A temple complex built 11,600 years ago by people who hadn't invented farming, pottery, or the wheel. The first carbon dates came back wrong. They had to be. Stone circles this sophisticated belonged to classical antiquity, not the Stone Age. But repeated testing confirmed the impossible. Hunter-gatherers had quarried, carved, transported, and erected 16-ton limestone pillars in complex geometric arrangements, then deliberately buried the entire complex. Klaus Schmidt, lead archaeologist, stood in the excavation pit staring at T-shaped pillars twice his height. Carved on their surfaces foxes, lions, spiders, snakes, vultures. A stone zoo animated by flickering torchlight. The pillars had arms carved along their sides, hands meeting at their fronts. They weren't pillars, they were stylized beings, gods perhaps, standing in eternal congress. Here's what breaks history. There's no evidence anyone lived at Göbekli Tepe. No houses, no hearths, no trash middens. But there are traces of massive feasts. Thousands of animal bones, mostly male, mostly young, the choice cuts of coordinated hunts. Beer brewing equipment suggests alcohol fueled these gatherings. This wasn't a settlement, it was a destination. The implications stagger. We've always believed agriculture enabled monument building. Surplus food freed labor for construction. Göbekli Tepe reverses that. The monument came first. Perhaps the need to feed workers during construction drove agricultural innovation. The temple didn't celebrate farming, it caused it. The mathematics alone confound understanding. Moving 16-ton stones without wheels required hundreds of coordinated workers. Feeding them without agriculture meant extensive hunting and gathering networks. Organizing them without writing meant sophisticated oral systems for planning and memory. These weren't simple hunter-gatherers, they were social engineers. Layer upon layer tells a story of obsessive rebuilding. Older circles were buried and new ones constructed above. The style evolved. Earlier pillars show more naturalistic animals. Later ones become abstract, symbolic. Something was changing in how these people saw the world, and they encoded that change in stone. Then, around 8000 BCE, they buried it all, not destroyed, carefully backfilled with rubble and soil. The site contains no evidence of violence, no conquest, no catastrophe. They simply decided Göbekli Tepe's time was over and entombed it like a pharaoh, preserving it for reasons we can only guess. The secret Schmidt believed he'd found before his death in 2014. Göbekli Tepe wasn't unique. Ground-penetrating radar revealed 20 more circles waiting underground. Similar sites dot the region. This wasn't one temple, but a tradition, a movement, a revolution in human consciousness that manifested in stone. We came together not to survive, but to mean something. The first permanent architecture wasn't shelter. It was shrine. Before we settled down, we reached up. Nobody planned to invent agriculture. At Abu Huraira in Syria, the evidence is clear. 11,500 years ago, a woman was grinding wild einkorn wheat on her knees, hour after hour, day after day. We know because her toe bones are deformed from the pressure, her knees arthritic from the posture, her teeth worn from eating stone-ground flour. She wasn't a farmer. She was a gatherer whose world was changing too fast to abandon old ways. The transition reads like tragedy in the bones. Pre-agricultural skeletons from the Levant are tall, robust, with excellent teeth and few signs of systemic stress. By 10,000 years ago, farmers were shorter, suffered from anemia, had cavities, and showed repetitive stress injuries. Agriculture didn't improve life. It enabled survival when the old life became impossible. Here's how it happened. During the Younger Dryas cold period, wild cereals that once carpeted the Levant retreated to isolated refugia. Humans followed, camping near the last reliable patches. They couldn't travel widely anymore. The good spots were too far apart. So they stayed, and staying changed everything. At first, they just protected wild stands, clear competing plants, maybe scatter seeds from particularly good specimens. The archaeological record from Ohalo II, dated to 23,000 years ago, shows someone already understood that seeds plus soil plus water equals food. But knowing and doing are different things. For 13,000 years, humans knew how to farm, but chose not to. The accident was selection pressure. When you harvest grain, you naturally select for plants that hold their seeds longer, the ones that don't shatter and scatter. When you replant, you choose the biggest seeds. Do this for a few centuries, not even intentionally, and you've created domestic wheat that can't survive without human intervention. At Jerf El Ahmar in Syria, we see the trap closing. By 10,000 years ago, storage facilities held tons of grain. But storing requires guarding. Guarding requires staying. Staying requires growing more. Growing more requires clearing land, which requires tools, which requires specialists, which requires feeding non-farmers, which requires growing even more. Each step seemed logical, necessary, temporary. Together, they were a ratchet that only turned one way. The gender dynamics shifted catastrophically. Hunter-gatherer women, typically space children 4 years apart through extended breastfeeding and mobility. Settled farming women could have children annually. At Ain Ghazal in Jordan, populations exploded from 100 to 3,000 in just 500 years. More mouths meant more fields, meant more work, meant more mouths. Disease followed density. Tuberculosis, unknown in hunter-gatherers, appears in early farmers. Malaria exploded in irrigation ditches. Measles jumped from cattle. Flu from pigs. The archaeological record from 10,000 years ago shows skeletal pathologies never seen before. Vitamin deficiencies from limited diets. Parasites from permanent latrines. Violence from defending fields. Yet they couldn't stop. Wild resources couldn't support the swollen populations. The knowledge of mobility was already fading. Children raised on grain didn't know how to read the landscape their grandparents had memorized. The accident was complete. Humans had domesticated wheat, but wheat had domesticated humans even more thoroughly. The skulls watched from beneath the floor. Plastered, painted with shells for eyes, they were ancestors transformed into architecture, the dead literally supporting the living. This was Jericho, 10,000 years ago. Not yet a city, but no longer a camp. Something unprecedented. A permanent address where generations would live, die, and remain. The Jordan Valley was an Eden for settlement. Fresh water springs, fertile soil, wild grains and gazelles abundant. But paradise required walls. Jericho's first wall, built around 8000 BCE, stood 12 feet high and 6 feet thick, fronted by a 30-foot tower. The construction required 10,000 tons of stone, carried by hand, shaped without metal tools. Why? No evidence of warfare exists. Perhaps floods, perhaps ceremony, perhaps just the psychological need to define us from them. Inside those walls, humanity was experimenting with a new way of being. Houses were round, semi-subterranean, entered through the roof. No streets. You walked across your neighbor's ceiling to reach your own home. Privacy hadn't been invented yet. Sound, smell, and movement were communal. When someone died, they were buried beneath the floor you walked on daily. After the flesh decayed, skulls were retrieved, plastered to recreate faces, and displayed. The dead weren't gone. They were furniture. The social contract was rewriting itself. At Ain Ghazal, 25 miles away, populations reached 3,000 by 9,500 years ago, coordinating that many people without writing, money, or formal government seems impossible, yet they managed. Houses were standardized, same size, same construction, suggesting emerging concepts of fairness and property. But stress fractures appear. Burned buildings, abandoned neighborhoods, evidence of conflict. Storage changed everything. Granaries at Daraa near the Dead Sea, dating to 11,300 years ago, could hold enough grain to feed a family for years. But storage meant ownership, inheritance, and inequality. Some graves contained beads and blades, others held nothing. The egalitarianism of hunter-gatherers was dying, replaced by something we'd recognize: social stratification. The psychological transformation was profound. Çatalhöyük in Turkey, inhabited from 9,500 years ago, reveals the anxious mind of early farmers. Every house contained shrines, plastered bulls' heads, vulture murals, bare teeth embedded in walls. Death was everywhere. Bodies under floors, skull displays, constant renovation as if trying to bury the past while living atop it. Analysis of stress markers in bones shows elevated cortisol, chronic anxiety in paradise. Labor specialized for the first time. At Jericho, we find evidence of full-time craftsmen, obsidian knappers whose workshops produce standardized blades, plasterers who waterproofed roofs, builders who understood load-bearing principles. The jack-of-all-trades hunter-gatherer was becoming obsolete, replaced by interdependent specialists who couldn't survive alone. Yet something beautiful was emerging. At Kurtiktepe in Turkey, communal structures from 10,500 years ago show elaborate decoration, carved stone vessels, decorated grinding stones, engraved pillars. When life became predictable, energy previously spent on survival could be redirected toward beauty, meaning, and memory. These weren't cities yet, but they were rehearsals for cities. Every innovation, property, specialization, inequality, architecture was a step towards civilization. The beads tell the story. At Shanidar Cave, 10,000 years ago, a child was buried with 1,500 carefully drilled shell beads, each representing hours of labor. Nearby, an adult's grave held 3. In that difference lies a revolution, the invention of inherited inequality. For 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in egalitarian bands. Leadership was situational. Best tracker led hunts, best diplomat negotiated with neighbors, but no one ruled. Property meant what you could carry. Status lasted only as long as competence. Death equalized everyone. Then, in just a few centuries, around 10,000 years ago, everything changed. The catalyst was surplus. When humans started storing grain, they created wealth that outlived its creators. A successful farmer could feed his children without teaching them to farm. Knowledge, once the only inheritance, became secondary to property. The grandson of a lucky farmer outranked the son of a master hunter. Meritocracy died in the granary. At Sayonu in Turkey, architecture reveals this transformation in real time. Early levels from 10,000 years ago show uniform houses, similar in size and construction. By 9,000 years ago, one building dwarfs the others. The terrazzo building, with polished lime plaster floors, an unprecedented luxury. Someone had convinced others to build them a palace. How? Violence? Charisma? Divine mandate? The stones don't say, but inequality had found its foundation. Gender relationships transformed catastrophically. Hunter-gatherer women provided 60 to 80% of calories through gathering, granting economic power and social autonomy. But farming was men's work initially. Clearing fields required upper body strength, plowing even more so when it appeared. Women's work shifted to processing, grinding grain, brewing beer, weaving textiles. Essential but stationary, repetitive, undervalued. The archaeological record shows women's arm bones developing asymmetrically from grinding, their knees deforming from kneeling at querns. Men's bones show stress too, but varied. They moved, decided, controlled. Violence escalated geometrically. At Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, a cemetery from 13,000 years ago shows 40% of bodies with violent trauma, but it was exceptional, noteworthy. By 10,000 years ago, violence appears everywhere. Fortified settlements, burned villages, mass graves. The first war cemetery at Tel Brak in Syria dates to this period. Not raids or feuds, but organized warfare, standardized weapons, coordinated tactics, and the birth of warriors as a social class. The cognitive revolution was subtle but profound. Humans began thinking in categories that hadn't existed. Owner, tenant, pure, polluted, chosen, common. At Nevelachori, ritual structures from 10,000 years ago show restricted access. Some spaces for everyone, others for select few. The democratic campfire was becoming the hierarchical temple. Children learned differently. Instead of observing all adults doing everything, they saw specialists, the potter, the weaver, the priest. Identity narrowed from human to farmer's son or potter's daughter. Potential became predetermined. The flexibility that defined our species for 200,000 years calcified into roles, ranks, and rules. Yet resistance persisted. Some groups violently rejected agriculture, burning granaries and scattering. Others maintained egalitarian structures despite farming. The revolution wasn't inevitable. It was a choice, made differently across the world, with consequences we're still sorting through 10,000 years later. Stand in a supermarket at midnight, fluorescent lights humming, surrounded by more food than your ancestors saw in a lifetime. You're the inheritor of the revolution that began 10,000 years ago. You gained everything: civilization, technology, knowledge, and comfort beyond imagination. But the price? That's written in your anxiety, your allergies, your aching back, and the antidepressants in your medicine cabinet. The trade was Faustian in its completeness. We traded 200,000 years of evolutionary fitness for 10,000 years of cultural evolution. Our bodies, built for walking 20 miles daily, now sit for 10 hours. Our minds, wired for 150 stable relationships, now scroll through thousands of strangers. Our immune systems, trained on parasites and pathogens, now attack pollen and peanuts. The numbers are stark. Hunter-gatherers worked 20 hours weekly. Medieval peasants worked 30. You work 47, plus commute, plus email. Hunter-gatherers ate 100 plus food species seasonally. You eat 20 species year-round. They lived in bands of 25 to 50 lifelong companions. You live among millions of strangers. They had no masters. You have dozens. Boss, landlord, government, algorithm. But you can read. That's not trivial. It's revolutionary. Literacy, impossible without agricultural surplus to support scribes, gave humans external memory. We could accumulate knowledge beyond any individual's capacity. Science, philosophy, literature, law. All impossible without writing, itself impossible without farming surplus. Medicine advanced from herbs to heart transplants. We conquered polio, smallpox, and plague. Average lifespan doubled. Infant mortality dropped from 50% to 0.5%. Pain became optional. Surgery became survivable. Death became negotiable. These aren't small victories. They're miracles your ancestors would worship, yet we're sicker than ever. Diabetes, unknown in hunter-gatherers, affects 10% of adults. Obesity, impossible when food was scarce, threatens more lives than starvation. Depression, anxiety, and suicide rates exceed anything traditional societies experience. We're dying from abundance, stressed by safety, depressed despite having everything. The social trade-offs cut deepest. We gained individual freedom but lost communal identity. You can become anything but belong to nothing. Move anywhere but never be home. Connect globally but touch no one. The freedom is real. No arranged marriages, no inherited obligations, no tribal law. But the loneliness is real too. We gain knowledge but lost wisdom. You know more facts than any human ever. The phone in your pocket accesses all recorded information. But you might not know which plants in your yard are edible when the moon rises, or your great-grandmother's name. We know everything about nothing and nothing about everything. The planet bears witness to our bargain. We feed 8 billion people on land that once supported millions. Victory? Yes, but topsoil depletes, aquifers drain, and climate changes. The stable Holocene that enabled agriculture is ending, partly because of agriculture. Our success threatens our success. But here's the twist. We can't go back. The knowledge exists, the population exists, the world has changed. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle required 100 square miles per person.